So lately I've been seeing a lot more of these type of memes floating around, which means, oh boy, it's that time of year again. Now, with the recent news of Welt's Nova Flare and potentially Jiao Cho's or even Nihility Blade, there's a lot of copium right now. However, the root of all this evil would of course stem from Acheron, which got me thinking, why is Acheron so weak right now? So naturally, the first place I looked was Acheron herself. Is the issue Acheron's fault? If she has weak multipliers, then that's pretty straightforward. She got power crept and her multipliers just can't keep up with HP inflation. So let's compare her with Anaxa, who's the benchmark tier 0.5 unit. He has fantastic low cost clears and isn't too broken or weak for general play. In a 500 AV 3 target scenario, Anaxa ends up with about 4500% total MV, while Acheron, assuming 2 ults as well, lands around 3600% MV. That's about an 18% difference in Anaxa's favor, which honestly isn't that big, and it definitely does not explain the 3 to 7 cost discrepancy in clears. So if the multipliers aren't the problem, then the next logical place is to look at self buffs. Perhaps Acheron just doesn't have enough raw stats. Now this was my original deduction for the video, so let's see how it actually plays out. Anaxa gives himself 90 damage bonus, 140 crit damage, and 28 defense shred. Acheron gives herself 90 damage bonus, 60% final damage increase with 2 Nihility, and 20% res pen. Now totaling everything up, you can cancel some stuff, and in the end, this section goes in favor of Acheron. So in the end, they in theory should be pretty relative, but again, that's just not the case. So with that section done, we can now determine if it's Acheron's fault. And the answer is yes. While it may not be the multipliers breaking her kit, it's everything else I'm about to list. And it all starts here. At a glance, her kit seems perfectly fine. But when taking a closer look, a really good look, it leads us back to Trace 2. Trace 2 not only defines Acheron's kit and is her biggest source of amp, it also simultaneously bricks her kit and it legit cannot be resolved without a Nova Flare. Now, Trace 2 is surprisingly balanced and does what it's intended to do. That being to even the playing field between Nihility and Harmony for Acheron. So let's take a look at my chart comparing the damage numbers between a few different scenarios. Thankfully, I used Fibble, so the numbers themselves shouldn't be off. When Acheron runs double Nihility, it's about 7% more damage than the best double Harmony comp, meaning that Trace 2 does work. And that's the problem. It's roughly on par with stacking Harmony. Acheron running her usual double Nihility comp needs a 60% final damage increase to beat the damage amp from using 2 Harmony units, not to mention the extra turns. And that leads to my first point. Nihility generally amps less than Harmony, and Acheron needs 2 of them. Acheron's current mainstream team uses Jiao Cho and Cypher. Together, they provide 90% vulnerability plus some true damage. For now, let's just look at the vulnerability, where 90% vuln generally means a 90% damage increase. Now on paper, 90% vulnerability sounds pretty huge. To put that into perspective though, if we start with 200 crit damage and 100 damage bonus, that 90% vulnerability ends up being equivalent to 113 crit damage and 76 damage bonus. And that's where things start to get awkward, because Sunday alone provides 127 CV and up to 80 damage bonus, meaning a single Harmony unit can almost match the entire amp of Acheron's double Nihility core. Yes, there's Cypher's roughly 20% true damage, but then again, we still have an entire support slot with Sunday. Moving on though, I want to go back to Anaxa. In terms of raw damage increase, what do you think is Anaxa's best teammate combination? Double Harmony, double Nihility, or 1 Harmony and Nihility? Well, looking at my chart, we can see that double Nihility generally performs the worst, with double Harmony being roughly 20 to 40% stronger. However, by far, the strongest combination is a Harmony and Nihility unit, and this all has to do with diminishing returns. Most modern units have a stupid amount of self buffs, so while Harmony units generally provide more buffs and thus higher amps, it's starting to become super oversaturated, and thus Nihility and alternative amps are becoming much more valuable. Acheron, however, does not have that luxury. Not only does she have barely any traditional self buffs such as attack, crit, and damage bonus, she's stuck with using 2 of the lowest amping D-mates. So while Anaxa runs into diminishing returns on buffs, he can remedy that by using a Nihility unit, Tribi. Acheron instead runs into diminishing returns on debuffs, primarily the high amounts of vulnerability. But for her, she's stuck with that. Moving on, you may have noticed that Nihility, in terms of amping, can actually be top tier. Now, the problem is, which ones? So let's take a look at the rest of the Nihility combinations. As you can see, the Jiaqiu and Cypher variant, her standard team, is the weakest iteration. Jiaqiu, her dedicated support, consistently ends up being the worst option in terms of raw amp. Cypher actually is generally pretty solid though. However, let's take a look at the buffed Swan and Wolf. Those two combined would deal 60% more damage than a current mainstream team, which is honestly kind of ridiculous. Now, this is due to the combination of Swan being a pseudo-harmony and the defense shred stacking. However, that's not what I want to focus on. Rather, my third point is that Acheron is the only character in the game where we're forced to choose between damage and ult generation. Let's say you choose Jiaqiu and Cypher. Well, now you're dealing significantly less damage, but you get more ults. But if you choose the Silver Wolf and Black Swan option, you deal a lot more damage, but now you're getting fewer ults. And in the end, the total damage still ends up being in the same dookie spot. It's literally the illusion of choice. There is no free will. But imagine a world where we got Wolf and Swan levels of amp, but Fox and Cat levels of debuff application. Well, actually, we don't need to imagine it, because that's literally every other DPS. When looking at Acheron, it feels like we're constantly weighing the cons, while for most other units, we're just looking at the pros. Take Archer for example. If it's single target, then we whip out the Cat. If it's AoE, then Tribi comes in. Nothing about that decision breaks the kit, because his abilities aren't reliant on funny mechanics or teammate requirements. This applies to Fei Xiao, but this video ain't about her. Moving on and expanding on this idea, let's talk about her ult generation. Acheron's ult generation is honestly pretty slow in 2026, and in most cases, we're looking at roughly a 2-turn ultimate, which used to be pretty good. However, when we compare it to newer units, it's really outdated, especially if her damage is locked behind it. Now on the screen is an E2 Acheron getting her ult. As you can see, it's taking quite a while. Now let's look at Casterus.
May this dispel the gloom, restore the sky.
So this is the warmth of life.
Show me the way.
So this is the warmth of life. Embrace a new life.
As you can see, it's pretty unfair. Hoyo, please give Casterus a Nova Flare. However, that's not the only issue. Acheron also gains nothing when being hit, a mechanic that's core to many teams and crazy runs. When an Acheron team gets obliterated, they just die. However, when a Casterus team gets obliterated, that's 50% ult charge. As you can see, some real devious work. Modern characters just gain ult charge from a lot of different sources. Let's look at Evanescia, who gains energy from both Certified Banger and Energy, making her one of the most flexible DPS in the game at the moment. But Acheron? She doesn't get that luxury. For characters like Acheron or Fei Xiao, who also have unique ult mechanics, it actually ends up restricting them instead. Because they can't generate charge outside of their own turns, the only fix for this is Jiaqiu and Avengering. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem, however, those two units are fairly weak right now. So once again, we end up at the same problem. We have to choose between either better ult generation or better raw damage. And that's really the core issue. Acheron was designed during a time where characters had clear weaknesses and balances, and you had to play around them, as there were actual trade-offs. Robin's a pretty good example, where you get crazy buffs but have awful ult generation. But over time, those limits have been broken over and over again. Meanwhile, we got Acheron and Fei Xiao, whose unique mechanic made them age very poorly. Moving on, I've currently explained how Acheron suffers due to her ult mechanic and her poor synergy with Nihility. So let me bring it back to Nihility. Because Nihility generally amps less than Harmony, Nihility has to compensate somewhere else to stay competitive. We don't get any action events or dance dance dance, which is a topic by itself, but regardless, all we have left is damage or being a sub DPS. And this leads directly to point 5. While Nihility amping is generally weak, their damage is somehow even worse. Now I'll be specifically looking at the damage coming from the wolf, fox, and cat. I'm gonna summarize this next part because this honestly can be an entire video by itself. Starting off, Nihility units have a massive stat distribution issue. Nihility supports need effect hit rate to land debuffs and also speed to apply them at a fast rate. That alone eats most of their substats. That's why you'll see many Nihility supports just building speed, effect hit rate, and HP, because having a hybrid build is very substat intensive. On top of that, the Eagle set also guts their damage even further. And it gets even worse. There's also the issue of actual scaling. Nihility characters generally have pretty low multipliers, and when you combine that with the lack of offensive substats, then it becomes rare for them to even deal 1% of the team's total damage. So let's take a look at what the perfect Nihility unit would actually look like. Tribi, a Harmony unit. She has great stats because you only build HP and crit. You don't even need speed because of her Trace 3. She has great multipliers and attacks very often, leading to solid damage and also enabling many characters. And on top of that, she applies permanent debuffs that don't even require effect hit rate. And she also gives respen and vulnerability, which should in theory be a Nihility's job. Meanwhile, actual Nihility supports get hit with all the restrictions while having literally none of the benefits. It's like being Mechamaru with his heavenly restrictions being crippled, meanwhile Gojo just exists. Now this brings back the question, why does 99% of Nihility units have such dookie multipliers? Well, it's because the second you give a sub DPS good multipliers, they instantly become a main DPS. Asheville was created to help Fei Xiao, but may end up just taking her spot. Whilst Nova Flare was created to help Acheron, but may end up just taking her spot. If I had a nickel for every time an old man took an Emanator spot, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. So to prevent that, Hoyo likely keeps Nihility's multipliers intentionally low. But this creates a paradox. Nihility can't have high multipliers as they'd be too versatile and deal too much damage like Weld. And because of in-game mechanics, their amps are generally weaker than Harmonies. So they end up stuck in this weird middle ground, where they're not strong enough to be a real sub DPS, but also not strong enough to compete with Harmony supports. And in the end, they just end up being bad at both roles. And unfortunately, Acheron needs 2 of these characters. Yeah, Acheron's situation is genuinely so funny and sad at the same time. Now, before I get to the conclusion and also fix this situation, I'm just gonna list out some other nitpicks. Firstly, her vertical investment is pretty dookie. Her E1 gives some stats, and her E2 puts her on an even playing field with every other DPS. Meanwhile, we have Firefly's E2, which post Nova Flare is legit double the damage. Secondly, Jiaoqiu's Ashen Roast can easily break the stack placement. And most annoyingly, her skill doesn't do anything, and also doesn't do a lot of damage. So when the enemy has slightly too much HP, then Acheron has to waste an entire ult to finish off the enemy. So now we're at the conclusion. Is Acheron cooked? Kinda. Does she need a Nova Flare? Ideally. Is there an easy fix to this? Yes. And that's simply to make Jiaoqiu or Weld a good sustain that generates hella stacks. High sustain V4. Yeah, it's really that simple. That way, we could run something like Sunday plus 2 Nihility units, which fixes her other issue of negative self buffs. And with Jiaqiu being a sustain, that means we can finally benefit from enemies taking their turns. Crazy concept, right? Now, I've also heard some people say how Jiaqiu may potentially be Nova Flared into a dedicated dot support. And for those people, I say shame on you. Acheron has literally been suffering for the past year. Meanwhile, we got Kafka Nova Flare, High Sealins, Black Swan Nova Flare, Huohuo Nova Flare, and now y'all trying to take away one of Acheron's only supports. This is literally the greed the Bible talks about. And these same people would be complaining about Firefly. Now, did Firefly need the buff? Absolutely not. Will I eat this shit up? Absolutely. Now, me personally, if I was an anniversary character, I wouldn't get power curved by a standard banner unit. But that's just me though. I guess some people just aren't built like that. Okay, but on a serious note, I really do hope Acheron and her team get some nice Nova Flares later down the line. There's of course some other candidates from 1.x like Argenti or Fushuan that I'd like to see, but a buff to a fan favorite would be pretty nice. And yeah, that's the whole video. I actually had so much fun researching and making this entire video. It's been a while since I've been able to do a deep dive because 4.x has been so chaotic. I'm telling y'all, I got a lot of video ideas like this on paper, but the issue is just time and timing. Now, as for the future, I likely will revisit Silverwolf and Evanescia again to analyze their final kits, and maybe another fun video like this afterwards. But besides that, I'll hope to see y'all in the next video, and peace.